No, I'm not worried at all. I rely on God, Allah.
Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Inshallah, we want to talk about one of the longest lasting Islamic empires in history, an empire that lasted 6 centuries. And at its height, at the end of Sultan Murad III, it amassed almost 20 million square kilometers. What is this empire? This empire is the Ottoman Empire. As I mentioned, at its apex, between the year 1575 to 1595, the Hijri calendar, 982 to 1003, it had over 2.8 million square kilometers of territory in Europe, over 4.8 million square kilometers in Asia, and over 12.2 million square kilometers in Africa. And if you look at the sum total in different times throughout history, there was almost 23 million square kilometers under its territory. At its height, it was at the gates of Vienna, Hungary. It had Hungary, Balkans, Greece, Ukraine, portions of the Middle East like Iraq, Syria, Palestine, Egypt, North Africa, and a large parts of the Arabian Peninsula. And then from its apex, this empire began to decline. Around the time of Sultan Salim II, many of the Sultan, the leadership, the elite class started to enjoy and become completely engulfed in the luxuries of their empire. And so they would spend the time within the luxuries of the palace instead of taking a leadership role in battle. Instead of being in the heads of government or taking a role in leading government, they would be within the palaces enjoying the luxuries. Instead of dealing with governments, foreign governments taking a leadership role there, or defending Islam on a world stage as being the representative, the Khalifa, they started to become more seclusionary. And this type of seclusion was endemic to Sultan Ahmed, who between 1603 to 1617 ended the 30-year or 300-year, tradition of the princes fighting for the throne. So there's this process of trying to keep the leadership competitive, or trying to have the best suited leaders for the role to be the Sultan. But he ended this practice. And so when they wanted to have a Sultan who now started becoming more and more of just a figurehead, almost like royalty and just a figurehead, a government official would come to the harem, this complex, this palace complex, and out of a gilded room select a sultan to now be their representative. Now, as the Ottoman Empire started to stagnate, the European Empire started to expand and started to grow. The Europeans started to discover the New World, North America, Central America, South America. And with these discoveries, a lot more gold and silver started to come into their empire. And so this influx of American silver, for example, caused a high amount of inflation within the Ottoman Empire. So in the year 1580, 1 gold coin was equivalent to 60 silver coins. 10 years later, 1590, 1 gold coin was equivalent to 120 silver coins. And by 1640, 1 gold coin was equivalent to 250 silver coins. As the time progressed, 1700s, Sultan Salim I, he gave France control, so gave jurisdiction of control over any of their French citizens within the Ottoman Empire, and also any Catholics, because France was known to be the representing of the Catholic religion. They gave actually control of any Catholics within their empire. In 1768 to 1774, there was a devastating war with the Russians where they lost a lot of territory. It was also a very big strain on their treasury. They lost territory like Crimea. Their treasury was depleted and they had a huge amount of debt, combined with, of course, some extravagant projects like Sultan Abdulhamid, the first construction of extravagant palaces. You had a completely depleted treasury. And then in the 1800s, many liberal reforms started to take place within the Ottoman Empire. Sultan Mahmud II, 1808 to 1839, he introduced a European style of governance and education and culture. So a lot of the clothing now was replaced, the traditional Islamic and Ottoman clothing was replaced with a European style of clothing. You would see the effects within the government structures, like, for example, the army. So in the army, they actually abolished this Janissary Corps, or the Inkishari, and they replaced it with Nizami Jadid, this new system. He was succeeded by Abdul Majid the First, 1839 to 61, 1861, and he introduced what was known as the Tanzimat, the introduction essentially of the French legal system and a lot of these liberal reforms within the Ottoman Empire. He was succeeded by Abdul Aziz, Sultan Abdul Aziz, 1861 to 1876. Now, what's significant are these Tanzimat reforms. So these liberal reforms that they imported from Europe to compete with Europe. So what this was to now take away power again from the Sultan, give it to the Vizier, so who was known, the Grand Vizier was known as Sadr al-Azam, and a particular figure who had this title was known as Mehdet Pasha. And what they would do is they started marginalizing any of the religious leaders, the shuyukh, and the Sultan himself, and they tried to undermine the Sultan. And so, of course, this line of thinking was very flawed from the beginning, this whole idea, this paradigm, that we've lost our core values, we've lost our core principles. And so by losing our core values and our core principles, we've now started to decay, we've started to now go into this state of loss. Now, instead of going back to the core values, the core principles that made you successful in the first place, why don't we copy what other people are doing that made them successful, that had their empire rise? And of course, their empires, so the European powers, the reason it worked for them was because they came out of a certain set of circumstances, okay? Coming from the Dark Ages, going through these liberal reforms. So that was a way for them to advance and progress their society. But that's not necessarily something that would help the Ottomans. And we'll see what type of effect that did have for the Ottoman Empire. And so the Grand Vizier, he took part in this conspiracy to actually kill Sultan Abdul Aziz. And it was falsely attributed that he committed suicide, but later investigation by Sultan Abdulhamid II revealed that it was not a suicide, but it was actually a planned murder. Sultan Abdul Aziz was succeeded by Murad V, and when he took over, he continued his process of liberalization within the Ottoman government and cultural structures. And he actually had a very good relationship with the British Crown Prince. And you would see now a lot of influence from Western educated government officials within the Ottoman Empire. And you had this movement known as the Young Turks, who thought that the Tanzimat reforms weren't liberal enough. They didn't go far enough. And Murad V eventually had a nervous breakdown and he had to abdicate the throne. Now, he was succeeded by a man who probably extended the life of the Ottoman Empire because at that time it was almost ready to collapse. So he probably gave it a renewed sense of life and extended its life from the edge of death. And that's Sultan Abdulhamid II. And, he ruled from 1876 to 1909, so 33 years. And he starts this process of Islah, this renewal and revival within the Ottoman Empire. So again, just to encapsulate, internally there's struggles, internally there's dissension, internally there's decay. They have a debt of 300 million liras. You have revolts, like I said, with grand viziers. You have European sympathizers, people who are actually advocating for European influence within the Ottoman Empire. And then externally, you have the Russian, the British, and the French threatening, taking over territories, battles, skirmishes, and strategic planning to cause the Ottoman Empire to become even more and more weak. And you have these revolts that are occurring. So you have Thrace, Macedonia, Arab rebels, Armenia, Kurdish revolts. So all these different revolts within their empire. Now, Abdulhamid II was a man to rise to the challenge. He was a man who was capable of dealing with what would seem unsurmountable odds. And so he actually disintegrated this Mab'uthan, this Ottoman parliament, early in his time. So he caused that to come to an end. And so he took a more direct role, and he was someone who was suited to take on this direct role after he dissolved this council, because he's bringing back again a different paradigm, a different sense of what that would save the Ottoman Empire. And his actions speak for themselves, because when you look at, for example, the Tanzimat reforms, you have alcohol being widely drunk and spread, okay, especially within the city centers, okay. But here's a man who had a deep love for Islam. He was willing to put in the work. He worked 14-hour days. He would take care of a lot of his own chores, his own tasks. He would fix his own shoes. He was very frugal in spending. He actually was able to reduce the debt, the state debt, down to 1/10 of its original debt. So from 300 million to 30 million liras. And because of this love of Islam, he wanted to actually establish a pan-Islamic organization. So even with countries that weren't part of the Ottoman Empire, he wanted to unite the Ummah on the basis of Islam. So he brought back the title of the Khalifa, and he wanted even countries like Iran to be part of this pan-Islamic organization. Okay, so even though they may disagree on Aqidah, even though there may be a disagreement on some of these issues, he felt that at least politically, being together as Muslims would give them a sense of power, a sense of self-respect, the ability to determine their own future within this geopolitical landscape. And as I mentioned before, he was a very dynamic personality. He was someone who was also known to be a poet. He was a wrestler. He was well educated, and he didn't shun European society by any means completely. Like, he went and he visited. He traveled to Europe. He saw what they were about, but he wanted to end this backwards practice of the Sultan being secluded from the world. And so this royal imprisonment, this practice of the royal family, the Sultan being like almost imprisoned within these harems, he went to end that. And his love for Islam, or his love for the Ummah, to bring it together, showed with a lot of the projects that he initiated. So in 1908, imagine at that time, he funded an Islamic university in Beijing, China. Okay, so the capital of China. And we all know the relationship right now China has with many Muslims in its territories. He actually funded an Islamic university there. He built a railway from Hijaz, so from Medina to Istanbul. So you would have this rail system now that's going from Istanbul to Medina, with one of the primary objectives actually is to help the people for Hajj travel within the Ottoman Empire to be able to go to Hijaz, and from Hijaz come out to the rest of the Ottoman Empire, with Turkey, other Muslim lands. And he took a very principled stance when it came to Palestine. So a man by the name of Theodor Herzl, who is the architect of the modern Zionist state known as Israel. He was an Austrian man who was a PhD in law. He wanted to establish a Jewish state in Palestine. And so what he did is he made this very lucrative offer to Sultan Abdulhamid II. And he said, listen, you have a lot of revolts within the Ottoman Empire. We're going to help quell those revolts. We're going to help protect your ships in European waters from pirates, from being harassed. We're going to, suppress these other nations within, like the Armenians who are causing issues. We're going to help suppress those rebellions. We'll settle the rest of your state debt. And on top of that, we'll give you 5 million gold liras. Okay. So very tempting offer. Okay. And so what was the response of Sultan Abdulhamid II? So this, I believe, is a test of his sincerity, of whether or not he truly believed in Islam. He truly believed in pan-Islamic ideas that he was preaching. Was he truly going to practice what he was preaching? Because oftentimes what happens is a person, when they call for Islam, or they call for Islamic unity, or they do some type of revival, they can be accused of what? Of trying to pander, of trying just to do it superficially for political points, right? A person can be accused. I think people have been, today are accused of that as well, to try to get political points. So I believe his statement reflects somebody who actually is not doing this for worldly political reasons, just to preserve and to expand his sphere of influence and power, but rather it shows that he truly believes in Ummah, he truly believes in the core principles of Islam. So he responded by saying, our ancestors sacrificed their lives for Palestine, so he could never give up 1 inch of it. Okay. And he predicted that if they got rid of him, he predicted that if they got rid of him, that they would be able to have Palestine for free. So he is rejecting huge amounts of money and wealth and power and prestige, but he realizes, because he's doing it as a principled stance, the next person to come take over, that if they don't do it on that same idea, that same principled basis, they would be giving it away for free. They'd be willing to even give it away for free, because Theodor Herzl, he made this offer many times. Many times he made this offer. And Sultan Abdulhamid, one thing we should note, what's happening on a world stage too, when he's talking about pan-Islamic unity, when he's talking about core Islamic principles, when he's talking about Quran and Sunnah, and trying to bring back a lot of the ideas that the Ottoman Empire initially was established upon, you have a different, you could say, now wave of ideas flowing through Europe and Russia. Okay, so you have now these atheistic liberal ideas that are coming across many of the European countries. You have atheistic ideas coming from Russia. Remember, now Russia was originally Orthodox Christian, and then they became atheistic and communist. Okay, and they transitioned into becoming the Soviet Union. So this, Bolshevik revolution comes in and takes away this orthodoxy, this Christianity, a lot of the values that they had before. You have now a weakening of the church in European countries, and you have this liberal secularization, a lot of the atheist values, and then you see this now permeating itself within Muslim countries and Muslim organizations within these countries. So you'd have, organizations with the title Al-Fatah with it. So Egypt Al-Fatah, the Al-Fatah in Levant, and in Turkey Al-Fatah as well, which would later on became more commonly known as the Young Turkish Party or the Young Turk Party. Young Turks, and it's spreading this this idea of liberalization and atheism. And then on top of that, you have the British and French who are trying to stoke Arab nationalism, and so you actually see that reflective now in some projects and initiatives within a lot of these Arab lands. So you have like this Arabic newspaper Al-Muqaddam Al-Ahram, who is trying to be a proponent of these nationalistic views. So in 1909, this culmination of all this opposition, liberalization, atheism, internally nationalism to weaken the state, causes now elements within the government and the army and this secret movement of Young Turks to depose Sultan Abdulhamid II. And so a delegation of 4 men came to inform Sultan Abdulhamid II of his deposition, and it was led by a man by the name of Emmanuel Carasso. And this person actually would later on collaborate with Italy in the Italian-Libyan war. So the Ottomans were actually supporting the Libyans in this war, and at a critical stage, this man conspired to have 30,000 Ottoman troops withdraw, giving a devastating blow to the Libyans. And so to help the spread of colonization, this one of these colonial powers, Italy, to take over and cause great losses amongst the Libyans. And so Sultan Abdulhamid II, he lived for 9 years in isolation, and the rest, the remnants of this Ottoman Empire were dismantled, and it was given in the hands of these Young Turks, and specifically a man by the name of Mustafa Kemal, or Mustafa Ataturk. He was the architect of the modern Turkish state. And so the Ottoman Empire ended in 1924. And so a few things to keep in mind of note. One is that, okay, this is happening internally, but also look at the backdrop as we see this continue. So we have Sultan Abdulhamid II, they bring him to deposition, but then we have these great world events happening at the same time. But behind the scenes of these world events, there's also further strategic planning to dismantle the Ottoman Empire. So the Ottoman Empire in World War I actually initially tried to join the alliance, okay, but they were refused, the ability to join the alliance, and so they joined the Central Powers in October of 1914. So, at this stage where they had nowhere else to, ally with, they allied with the Central Powers, and the British already had a plan to dissolve the Ottoman Empire. So under the British rule, they actually controlled Egypt. They were able to take that away from the Ottomans in 1818. And also they were ruling over India in 1857. And so their strategy was to turn the Arabs within the Ottoman Empire against the Ottomans. And so if we look at, for example, famous figures like Lawrence of Arabia, okay, and there's movies based on his life, he was able to stoke the sense of nationalism within Arab tribes, and it also trained them to how they can revolt and rebel against the Ottoman Empire. This British High Commissioner to Egypt, a man by the name of McMahon, he actually allied with, or he corresponded with a man by the name of Sharif ibn Hussein ibn Ali, who was the governor of Mecca at that time. And so he communicated with him and said to him, listen, we will give you an Arab empire. You're going to be the king of the Arabs. And we will give you Hijaz, so Arabian Peninsula, and Syria, so Levant, is going to be in your kingdom. So this Arab empire is going to be under your rule. And so he's stoking him to revolt against the Ottoman Empire so he can have his own kingdom. And so if we look at how the level that they went to help craft this division and stoke this nationalism, it's very amazing, actually, and it's very strategic and it's very planned, and we can see the remnants of it today. So they actually designed a flag for the Arab rebels, which had 3 horizontal bars and a triangle to the left. And actually that flag became a model for the flags in Jordan, Syria, Palestine, Sudan, and Kuwait. And I remember as a youth, being very young, but at the same time, you're idealistic, you love the Ummah, but sometimes you're not educated, and that's important to be educated about history and about your deen as well. I remember commenting to one of the brothers saying that, listen, what would be cool is to have a shirt that says Ummah on it and then show all the flags of all the nations that are Muslim, right? And they said, you know what, actually that's a source of sadness when you look at all these different nationalistic flags, because shows the source of division, how we were completely divided. You know what I mean? Because we were, it's an ummah, like the Khilafah, the Muslim world is supposed to be united. This is the vision of what a Khilafah should be or what an ummah should be. And so before Sharif, so they're saying this to Sharif Hussein, promising him an Arab kingdom. Simultaneously, they have alternative plans. The British and France have alternative plans. And so they planned between 1915 and 1916. They had 2 diplomats by the name of Mark Sykes, representing Britain, and Francois Georges Picot of France. They decided they secretly met, these 2 representatives of the British and the French, to decide the fate of the post-Ottoman and Arab world. Okay, so even before World War I ended, they're already planning how they're going to basically have the Ottoman Empire come to an end, divide up the Ottoman Empire, and how they're going to divide up the Arab world. Okay, so even though a kingdom was promised to the Arabs, to Sharif Hussein, they're already planning to betray him. Now, according to this Sykes-Picot agreement, the French and British would divide the Arab world amongst themselves. So Britain would get Iraq, Kuwait, and Jordan, and France would get Syria, Lebanon, and southern Turkey. Okay, and if you look at the way that they would even divide the borders, like a ruler. Okay, like the way that they would divide up the empire, it's like someone's taking a protractor and a ruler and just dividing things up, as if a knife is being cut to divide these Muslim lands. And it's at this point I'm reminded of the hadith of our Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam, when he said that the nations will come upon you from every side, just as diners gather around a mean dish. And so, as somebody's calling around a dish and people say, come eat from this, and they slice it up and they start, serving it to people. And so the Sahaba radiallahu anhum, they asked the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, is it because we're going to be few in number at that time? Because the Sahaba are thinking from their paradigm. They're thinking from their perspective. They're thinking maybe the days of Mecca when they were a few, just like, almost just like 100 maybe. Or even less than that earlier on, when you had just a few dozen. And they would be oppressed, they would be subjugated to all sorts of torture and harm and abuse. And they had strong iman, but they just didn't have the means to really fight and defend themselves. And so they were exploited. In Mecca, there was a boycott. So they were financially exploited, they were physically exploited, they were politically exploited. So they're thinking, are we going to become so reduced in numbers? Because they're thinking Islam means something. Being a Muslim means something. Truly having Iman has a deep meaning associated with it. right? So they're thinking from that perspective, that they're just so small in number that people are just able to overwhelm them. Is that the reasoning for it? Because in their minds, they could never imagine that they would have the hearts of cowards, or the hearts that aren't connected with primarily serving the deen of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Okay? He said, no, it's not because you're going to be few in number. Actually, you're going to be very numerous, but you're going to be like the scum on the ocean, on the sea. And there will be feebleness in your hearts, and the fear of you in the hearts of your enemies will be removed. And why will that occur? It's because of hubb dunya, because of your love of dunya. This you primarily prioritize the dunya over everything because you love it so much. Hubb dunya kariyat al-maut, and you fear death. Okay, if you fear death, that means you're actually working everything to establish your home, your permanent home, in this dunya. When we know that this dunya is a means, we work in these means, but we know that the everlasting home is in the akhirah, right? So it's a different paradigm, it's a different mindset. It's hard to like overcome and bully somebody who has that type of mindset. It's hard to defeat somebody who has that type of mindset. And so our Rasul says, no, it's actually the condition of your hearts that's going to cause this. It's a state of your heart that will actually cause this type of weakness, this type of exploitation, this type of situation where two men can sit in a room, take a map, divide up the ummah like a cake, and just start serving it to each other. And they relegated in their agreement, or they kind of put a pin in it, that Palestine would be considered for Zionist ambition, and this became more formalized, and it was allocated to the Zionist movement with the Balfour Declaration. Now, the Ottoman Empire ended in a tragedy. This is such a tragic end to one of the longest lasting Islamic empires in history, one of the greatest empires in history. And so this no one can deny, especially a Muslim, how tragic it came to an end, especially of how the Sultan was treated, Sultan Abdulhamid II, who had this deep love for Islam and Muslims, and initiated projects as a reflection of that. And to see it gutted, right? All these Islamic principles just gutted. When Mustafa Kemal took over, he had many Islamophobic principles and policies that he instituted. It was a deep seated hatred of Islam. So he didn't completely eliminate Islam completely, because the idea was to have a transitory Islam. So what he wanted to do was weaken Islam so much, make it as symbolic as possible, take out any of the real influence of Islam. So take it out of the court system, take it out of the education system, take it out of any of the government system, and then all the symbols, and any of the practices, weaken it or marginalize it. So for Muslim men, they had to dress a certain way, or they were pressured to dress in European dress. You couldn't wear an imama publicly. They tried to take out the Turkish fez, the hat that they would wear, the Muslim dress for Muslimas, the veil, the hijab. It wasn't completely banned, but you can go into government institutions. You can have government jobs. You can go into universities. Many Muslim women, actually Turkish women, later on, and I witnessed this myself during my university years, they couldn't go to university in the land that they were born in. So they had to come to Canada, they had to come to America, they had to come to Europe if they wanted higher education. Because what would also happen is that you would have more practice of Islam in the rural areas, so the countryside. The city centers, they had more of a strict grip on it, but you'd have more of Islamic practices. But imagine you're this, this young Turkish girl wants to get an education, you're getting educated, and now it's time to go to university. The universities are in the cities. You can't go now to a university, an Islamic university. You have to go outside of the university. And guess what would happen when they would come back, to visit their family in the airports? They would be interrogated for hours So if you think it's bad now after 9/11, where you have many Muslims, anytime they were flying, they're on these no-fly lists, they're interrogated for hours and hours and hours. Our Turkish sisters were suffering this for decades, even before 9/11. The type of harassment, imprisonment that they would go through, and they would demonstrate outside of universities, and they would beat them up, they would round them, they would put them in prisons. And so these are all remnants of the policies that Mustafa Kemal had. He tried to eliminate the sources of knowledge. Remember, our iman is based on ilm, it's based on dalil. This is why iman remains so strong in Muslim countries and societies today, is because it's linked to knowledge. It's not linked to whims and desires or the zeitgeist of the time. It's linked to our Quran and our Sunnah, the writings of our scholars, and so forth. That's why Arabic language has such a strong role within that. And these people, they understood this. These liberal reformers understood this, so they wanted to gut out the Arabic language from their society. So previously, Turkish language, you would use Arabic script, Persian script, so the Islamic languages, the script of the Islamic languages. So they Latinized everything. So they took all of that out, put Latin. They started banning the Arab Qur'ans, the Arabic books of knowledge. They started closing down madrasas, ending any new masjid projects. They made Hagia Sophia a museum. They started, taking out Arabic from the adhan. So the adhan now became in Turkish. So completely taking that out. And even the Quran, like, it wasn't even a good translation in Turkish. So they're trying to influence the understanding of Islam through that as well, because of these poorly translated, or these corrupted, these translations that were corrupted amongst the Turkish people. So there was a lot of, so whether it's economically, educationally, legally, all of these different things were now affected during and instigated by Mustafa Kemal, and of course, formally ending the Khalifa, to exist, and even the title of Sheikh al-Islam. So, like, having somebody as a head for the Muslims to turn to get rulings and things like that. So tragic. What a tragic end to a beautiful empire that used to be the golden jewel of Islamic history. But when we look at history, when we look at things like this, we look at it as a whole. As Muslims, we should appreciate that the essence of Ahl Sunnah wa Jama'ah does not only mean that all the Muslims are together in one Jama'ah, but that we should always look at things holistically. When the scholars, they talk about what Ahl Sunnah Jama'ah means in all its different dimensions, we take all of the Quran and the Sunnah. So we don't pick and choose the Quran and the Sunnah, and we have selective memory, and we have a selective agenda of what ayat we use and what hadith we use. We take all of the ayat of Quran. We take all the authenticated hadith. We look at all of history, and we learn from it. We look at all of the Ummah. We look at all of the Sahaba, radiyallahu anhum, and then from there we derive the plan and prioritize, and we understand things in a better way, right? So even though the Ottoman Empire ended in tragedy, one must not fail to remember that the way that the Ottoman Empire was established was because of a tragedy. The Ottoman Empire would not have been started if it wasn't for a great tragedy in the Muslim world. The greatest empire, the longest lasting empire, would not have started if it wasn't for a great tragedy, a great fitna, a great calamity within the Muslim world. Genghis Khan, the leader of the Mongols, the Tatar, they started ravaging the Muslim world. They attacked Iraq, Eastern Asia, the 7th century after Hijrah, or 13th century CE. And this attack led to 500,000 people from Western Turkestan to leave. So, for example, in year 1617 after Hijrah, 1220 CE, Zurgudai Noyan and Subutai Noyan, They were either brothers or cousins. They led this army in eastern or western Turkestan, which caused a migration, huge migration of many of these Turkestani people. One of which was a tribe by the name of Kayi, okay, or Qabi, and they migrated, so they're escaping this brutality from the area of towards the area of Asia Minor, which today is like makes up 90% of the land mass of Turkey. So this was and they're escaping towards what would be present day known as Anatolia. Okay, so and this group, this tribe, is made up of approximately 100 families, about 4,000 people, and it's led by a man by the name of Ertugrul. Okay, Ataturk. Yes, you know, to watch Ertugrul, you can see him on Netflix, right? So the same Ertugrul. Okay, and so while fleeing, Ertugrul and his tribe of Kayi, they witness a battle between the Seljuk Muslims. Okay, so Sultan al-Din Qaykubadi, the first of Konya, and the Byzantines, and so the Muslims were losing at this time. So the Seljuk Sultan al-Din, he's losing at this time, and so imagine these people. They're refugees. They're migrants. Okay, and they themselves are in need, but they see Muslims that are in need, and so he comes to the aid of Sultan al-Din, and you know, he provides. You have a group of these 444 soldiers who help the Seljuk Sultan, and they help him bring victory and help defeat the Byzantines. And so, you know, for me, this is like a core principle in Islam, and that is, if you see something wrong, you should try to change it. And this comes from the Hadith of Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam, on the authority of Abu Sa'id al-Khudri, radiyallahu anhu. He said, I heard Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam saying, whoever sees an evil, let him change it with his hands, and if he's not able to do so, then let him change it with his tongue. Okay, you know, speak out against it, and if you can't do that, then at least minimally hate it in his heart. Okay, and that is the weakest form of iman, is just to remain silent, not do anything, but just hate it in your heart. So at least minimally hate it in your heart. That's the minimum thing that you can do. So here's a person who is in need himself. But look at the mettle of these people, the core values of these people, that even though they ran away from oppression, they see oppressed Muslims and they come to serve and help those oppressed Muslims, or these Muslims that are about to lose this battle. So the Seljuk Sultan, he was so impressed by this, and he realized that these people were also looking for a homeland. So he gave a portion of his land between his empire and the Byzantines. So it was also a strategic decision, because he saw them as being brave and courageous and warriors. So it almost acted like a buffer. Okay, so it's almost this area of West Ankara today, present-day West Ankara, and it's a small area, so 2,000 square kilometers. Okay, he gives this area to them. So Ertugrul ibn Sulaiman, he expanded this area against many battles against the Byzantines, and he expanded to 4,800 square kilometers. So it went from like 2,000, and he more than doubled it through its expansion. And he died in the year about 680 after Hijrah, and he had 3 sons. At the age of 90 years old, you know, so he lived quite a long life. And he had a particular son who would now become the man whom the Ottoman Empire would be named after. So his son, by the name of Uthman, was born in the year 606 after Hijrah. Okay. Now, what's interesting to note is that his son, Ottoman Empire, or Dawlat, in Arabic we would say Dawlat al-Uthmaniyya. Okay, so the Ottoman Empire is named after Uthman. So sometimes you'll see the Turkic version of the name might be spelled slightly different. So instead of Sultan Muhammad al-Fatih, they'll say Sultan Mehmed al-Fatih, right? So Uthman, he was born in the same year that Hulagu, the Mongol, invaded Baghdad and killed and destroyed the Khilafah. Okay, the same time the Abbasid Khilafah fell. And he was born in the same year. Imagine this. A man whom would be named after the greatest Islamic empire in history was born the same year as one of the greatest tragedies in entire Islamic history. Wow. That year that Hulagu sacked Baghdad, Ibn Kathir writes, they attacked the country and killed everyone. They found the men, the women, the children, and the elderly. And many people hid in wells and rubbish bins, so in garbage like dumps, and grasslands for days, while others grouped together and locked themselves inside shops and masajid. But the Tartars, they broke in, they demolished the doors, they burning these stores and these fronts and the people inside. They chased the fleeing residents and they slaughtered them on the roofs. None of them escaped except the Jews and the Christians and those who had sought their protection. So it was a massacre. It was a massacre. You would have people hiding in dead bodies. You know, they say 1 million people died in Baghdad, like the mountain of skulls that they would have. Okay, one of the greatest genocides in history, because it's not like they have, modern warfare like we do today with, even with guns and bombs and whatnot to kill 1 million people is a huge undertaking. And so they had this devastating blow within the Muslim world. This nightmarish horror occurred the same year, subhanAllah. People didn't know that there would be a boy born that would bring hope and respect and honor and dignity to the Muslim world. That's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when he tells us in Surah Al-Baqarah, ayah 216, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us, وَعَسَىٰ أَن تَكْرَهُوا شَيْئًا وَهُوَ خَيْرٌ لَكُمْ وَعَسَىٰ أَن تُحِبُّوا شَيْئًا وَهُوَ شَرٌ لَكُمْ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he tells us that it may be that you dislike a thing which is good for you and that you like a thing which is bad for you. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala goes on to say, Allah knows that which you do not know. At this ummah's lowest point, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala brought hope. And that's why it's important for us to appreciate something. Is oftentimes we don't believe something until we see it, right? So seeing is believing. But if you believe in the hope of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you have to actually believe in the unseen. So to truly see, you need to believe first. You need to have iman first for you to be able to truly see. Okay? And we see in that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives us indication of this, of like how these trials and tribulations have a benefit. Even though it's so devastating, there's a benefit in it that we cannot see, but we should reflect upon. Because if you look at history, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, now when you look retrospectively, you can see it afterwards. But at that time, imagine the iman that you would need to have to be able to see and believe in the promise of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So for example, in Surah Al-Qasas, ayah 4, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, truly Fir'aun elated himself in the land, or elevated himself in the land and divided its people. So divide and conquer is as old as Fir'aun himself. It's as old as Shaitan, okay? So divide and conquer, divide and conquer. He divided the people into sections so he could rule over them. He could maintain this iron grip. So truly Fir'aun, he elevated himself, he elated himself and divided its people into sections, oppressing a small group amongst them. When you divide people, you're going to have your favorites, people you're going to favor, and you're going to people you oppress, because you always want to play people against each other. And he slew their sons, but kept their females alive. So maybe Fir'aun was the first militant feminist. Okay, next on Donahue. Okay, I know, dated reference. Okay, so here, and then the ayah goes on to say, for he was indeed a maker of mischief. And then the two ayats, this ayah 4 and so Al-Qasas ayah 5 to 6, he said, we wish to be gracious to those who are oppressed. Look at this, what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying. He's saying, after Allah says that you were divided and you were conquered, and your sons were killed en masse, so infanticide, okay? So he's causing this brutal oppression. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying is to them, we wish to be gracious to those who were oppressed in the land. Okay? To make them leaders in faith and make them heirs, to establish a firm place for them in the land. Their trial, their tribulation, all these horrors that they endured, all these challenges that they endured, was to make them leaders. It was a tarbiyah process. It was a process of tarbiyah. Because for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, remember, it's kun fayakun. Be and it is. If Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants to bring forth something, it's very easy for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to bring forth something. But if he wants the ones, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala chooses as in pleased with certain rulers, certain leaders. Remember, anybody can be a leader. You could have somebody who is a leader in evil. And come on, let's be honest. Like, after the star of The Apprentice can become like a leader of the world's largest, a country in the world, most powerful military in the world. Anybody can be a leader. Let's understand that. Let's put that on the shelf. That anybody can be a leader, but the leader that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is pleased with is are those people who have certain qualities and characteristics, right? They have to be the antithesis of Fir'aun. So Fir'aun, if you look at his life from the Quran and the Hadith, he didn't have a tough life. He had a very, very easy life. Okay, he had a very luxurious life. He had arrogance. He had all of these different things. The opposite of those that would succeed him, that would be able to overthrow him. Musa alayhi salam, Bani Israel, and afterwards Yusha bin Nun, and all of these people from Bani Israel, they were able to overthrow him because they went through this tarbiyah process. They had certain qualities and characteristics. Okay, they went through a certain level of education and training to be qualified to be leaders and be leaders that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is pleased with. Okay, so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, what he does with these trials and tribulations, he's giving you a training, and at the same time, to make the group that he will be pleased with, he wants to separate the people who are not an embodiment of this praiseworthy group. Okay, so he wants to separate them. In Surah Muhammad, ayah 4, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, but if it had been Allah's will, he could certainly have extracted retribution from them himself, but he let you fight in order to test some of you with others. So he wanted to see. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he not that he wanted to see, but he wanted to show. That's a better word. Okay, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows, it's in his ilm, but he wanted to show the people amongst themselves who are true to their covenant, who are true to their deen, who are on the haqq, not just speaking it, but it was the state in their hearts. He wanted to separate those people from those people who were fakers. Okay, those people who were just putting on a front, those people who today have showed really nice social media profiles and show all this these stances on woke justice, but if you were to meet them in real life, would they have the guts to stand up for somebody who is being oppressed, right? So I've given this analogy before, is that how do you know the mettle of a person? How do you know the true nature and the true characteristics of a person? What a person is truly deserving of until you put them through those tests. How do you know a piece of metal is different from another piece of metal that looks identical to it? Okay, two pieces of metal could look identical to one another, but one metal maybe has properties where it can resist crushing more. One metal has a property that it can resist breaking under tension, that it needs a higher temperature to melt it under heat. So when under heat, it needs a higher temperature. It can resist more, or that its resistance to pressure. Okay, so it's pressurized. It doesn't crush. It doesn't break. How do you know that? Until you test those pieces of metal. I can present you two identical pieces of metal. You would think they're the same until you test them. Until you test them. You could have a basketball team that you could make all these cool promos for. So you have this basketball team, and you always show cool promos from them. You show like these highlights of people making every single shot. Okay, so these edited highlights, and you show them walking through slow motion through fog and getting into like these expensive sports cars, like the players on the team, and they're all wearing like the latest I don't know what, like Air Jordans, whatever, crazy basketball shoe, whatever crazy, like you can make them look so crazy, and every time they're tip off to do a tip off against another opposing team, the other team forfeits, and so they're undefeated up until the championships, and year after year they're undefeated. So it makes no sense that they never went through any trial and tribulation. How can you truly call them champions? Maybe on paper they're a paper champ, but it doesn't mean that they're real champions, right? How do you know which one of those players can play through pain? That they get an injury, they can play through pain. How many of those players do you know are really truly team players that if they get under pressure, that they're not going to blame other team members and start cutting and running and causing dissension within the team? How do you know the qualities of who is a true superstar, who truly works in practice day in and out? Yes, we're talking about practice, right? How many of them showing up for practice? So how do you know that until you test them, right? Until you test those people. How do you know who are the winners, who are the quitters? And so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tests people. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tests the Ummah at that period of time. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tested Ertugrul, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tested this nascent tribe that was escaping. And what would they do now? What tests were they given? How would they pass those tests, and what would be the result of this test? And that will give us some clues, and that will give us an indication, inshallah ta'ala, of how this empire became one of the greatest empires in all of history, not just Islamic history, but of all of history. So inshallah, we will continue this series in our following podcasts, because we are here to always try to spread the Haqq. Because remember, we live by the Haqq, we die by the Haqq. And just when you think life is stuck, tune in to Life Haqq. Next week, we'll continue on the Ottoman Empire. Jazakumullah khair. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Do I feel that the New York police are providing enough protection, or do I have to have protection of my own? I look for protection from Allah.